This is 13.1 Upper Respiratory Tract Notes. The essential question is, what are the functions of the respiratory system and what organs make up the upper respiratory tract? The respiratory system is broken down into two parts. The upper respiratory tract, which is made up of the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and the pharynx. The lower respiratory tract involves the larynx, the trachea, bronchial tree, and the lungs. The major organs of the respiratory tracts are structures that actually the air passes through. So structures like the nostril, which is the opening to the nasal cavity, then the nasal cavity, then you've got the pharynx, then you have the larynx, then you have the trachea, the bronchus, and the right and left lung. Those are all structures that the air actually passes through. The other structures like the sinuses, the hard palate, the oral cavity, the soft palate, the epiglottis are more of the associated or accessory organs that might help in respiration but is not a primary organ in the respiratory system. The major function of the respiratory system is for gas exchange. The gas exchange is between the oxygen or the air in the environment, then enters through the respiratory system and it enters the blood. Then it is the job of the cardiovascular system to deliver that oxygen to the tissue that it needs. Also, specifically the organs of the nasal cavity, their job is to clean the air, purify it so there's no any kind of harmful particles. It is to warm the air and to moisten and humidify the air before it gets into the lungs. Nose is the external portion of the nasal area. It is the openings to the nose is called the external nares or the nostrils. That's how the air enters the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is the internal inside portion of the nose, and it is divided by a wall called the nasal septum. Remember, septum means wall. On the lateral sides of the nasal cavity are these bones that kind of stick out. You have the superior concha, the medial concha, and the inferior concha, which you learned in the skeletal system. The nasal cavity is the internal portion of the nose, and at the roof of the nasal cavity is the olfactory receptors, which basically is connected to the olfactory bulb, and then the olfactory tract, which is involved in the sense of smell. Recall that the entire respiratory tract is lined with the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, specifically ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and any type of columnar epithelium also contains structures called goblet cells, and their job is to produce mucus. So the entire respiratory tract is covered or lined with mucus, and their job is to moisten the air, and also because it is sticky, it traps any kind of foreign particles that might enter the respiratory tract. Again, lateral walls of the nasal cavity is lined with concha, the superior, the middle, and the inferior concha. They're also called terminates. Okay, their job is to increase the surface area where the air can come in contact with the wall of the nasal cavity, so they are actually coming in contact with the mucous membrane where the mucus can trap any kind of particles that are in the air. And it also increases the turbulence, which then causes more of the air to come in contact with the mucous membrane so they could be cleaned more efficiently. So looking inside the nasal cavity, remember those superior, middle, and the inferior concha could also be called the superior, middle, and inferior turbinates. Without the structure, when the air is moving through the nasal cavity, it would remain in a ball so that only the outer portions of the air would come in contact with the nasal cavity, and so only the outside will be cleaned. But now these turbinates or the concha create channels where the air actually has to pass through a narrow opening. Okay, that means the air are moving in a thinner line so that the air is broken up and they're coming in more contact with the nasal cavity where it can be cleaned. And because these areas or these channels are narrow, the air comes in contact with the nasal cavity, and so it can't move in a linear line. So what happens to the air, instead of moving it in a linear line, it actually... Paranasal sinuses are spaces within the bone. There are 4 specific bones that contain paranasal sinuses. The frontal bone is the forehead bone. The sphenoid and ethmoid bones are bones that make up the floor of the skull. And the maxillary bone, which is the upper jawbone. These are the 4 bones that contain the sinuses. The function of the sinuses is to lighten the skull. Because there are empty air chamber spaces, it does lighten the skull because bone is heavier. Then also these spaces creates an echoing chamber for creating voice and sound. And because the paranasal sinuses are lined with mucous membrane, mucosa, they also produce mucus. And then when you get sick, sometimes there is an overproduction of mucus, then the sinuses, instead of being filled with air, fills up with mucus, and then that's when you get that congested and the headache, the sinus headache, where it's completely when you feel like you're on a kind of stuffed up, and when your nose is running a lot is because your sinuses are emptying all of these mucus into your nasal cavity and through your throat. Here are the bones that contain the paranasal sinuses. You have the frontal bone, then you have the sphenoid bone in the yellow, and then you have the ethmoid bone in the kind of a lighter green, and then you have the maxillary bone in the orange. And so when these sinuses, when you're sick, have an infection, get filled with mucus, that's when you get that congestion. Pharynx is the throat. It is made up of 3 portions, and it is a muscular passageway, and it aids in a passage of food, water, and air, and also it aids in swallowing. There are 3 regions of the pharynx. The most superior or the upper portion is called the nasopharynx, and it is only passage for air, nothing else. And it is the space behind the nasal cavity. Just below that is the oropharynx, which is the space behind the mouth. That's where it gets the name, oro meaning the mouth. Then below that is the laryngopharynx, which is the area just above or attached to the larynx. Remember that the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are not only passage for air, but it also is a passage for food and water. So here's the area in green is your nasopharynx, the area which is the space behind the nasal cavity. Then you have the yellow is the oropharynx, is the space just behind the mouth, the oral cavity. And then what they call hypopharynx is the laryngopharynx, and it is the space right above the larynx. Larynx is here, so this entire area is the laryngopharynx. 13.1 notes homework. Number 1, explain how air is moved and cleaned in the nasal cavity. Number 2, name the parts of the pharynx in order and what passes through each. For example, air, food, and water. Number 3, what is the function of the paranasal sinuses?